So I will be speaking today on love of the dead and the suspension of the ethical. And my paper asks what place there is for mourning in Kierkegaard's thought, and argues through a reading of Fear and Trembling and Either or that mourning, contrary to what one might suppose, takes place within a suspension of the ethical insofar as it attends to the deceased person's singularity and rejects any assimilation of him or her into the universal. The portrait of Abraham in Fear and Trembling risks giving the impression that the knight of faith is isolated from others to the point that there is no place in his life for a love that would extend unto mourning the other's death. Even one who is not called to sacrifice his son could not, so it might seem, mourn another's death, since mourning might appear incompatible with the conviction of the knight of faith that he will receive again what he seems to have renounced. Indeed, a number of authors, including Emmanuel Levinas, have challenged the account of the teleological suspension of the ethical given in Fear and Trembling on the grounds that the knight of faith is dangerously solitary and that Kierkegaard fails to realize the importance of our relation to other people. And I cannot look at all the aspects of that debate here. I'll be focusing specifically on the question of mourning the other, which is a topic that for the most part these discussions have not directly addressed. And so I propose to intervene in the discussion of the place of love of the other in the way Kierkegaard thinks faith, by comparing Abraham, who willingly goes to sacrifice his beloved son, and Antigone, who is known for burying and mourning her brother, and who in Either or desires to bear her father's curse with him. And ultimately, I will be arguing that mourning is a resistance to death and a call for the restoration of what seems to have been lost, and in this way, mourning may be an act of faith. Moreover, I will conclude that love of God and love of others both take place within the suspension of the ethical. So let us begin then with the story of Abraham as Johannes de Silencio tells it. Abraham, when he goes to sacrifice Isaac, has made both the movement of infinite resignation and the movement of faith by which he is assured that he will receive Isaac back again. The knight of infinite resignation suffers but is resigned. Abraham, however, is resigned and also makes the movement of faith. He too suffers, but not in the manner of the knight of infinite resignation. Everyone, we are told, can understand the suffering of the tragic hero who acts for the sake of duty. Agamemnon, who was required by the gods to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia so that the Greek fleet could sail for Troy, and whom de Silencio repeatedly contrasts with Abraham, had a comprehensible reason for killing his daughter, so we can understand that he had to sacrifice her, even though he had no desire to do so. And so we can understand that killing her caused him sorrow, while we also admire him for overcoming that and doing what was necessary for the sake of the Greek armies. His duty as a king outweighs his duty as a father, and in the sorrow of resignation, he is comforted by the knowledge that he has upheld the ethical law. As de Silencio puts it, and I quote, Agamemnon gives up Iphigenia and thereby finds rest in the universal, and now he proceeds to sacrifice her. End quote. Abraham finds no such rest, since he has set out to violate his ethical obligation toward his son simply because he believes that God has called him, as an individual, to commit this act that the ethical law forbids. His faith that he will receive Isaac again does not spare him from suffering, for he does mean to kill his son in obedience to God. And he can explain neither why he is going to kill his son, nor why he has faith that his son will be restored to him. He bears a secret because he cannot speak without being thought mad. And so here, therefore, there seems to be no place for anything we might recognize as mourning, and for two reasons. First, if Abraham did mourn in advance, he could not communicate it, since what he is about to do defies the ethical law. And second, he has faith that Isaac will be restored, and not in the next world, but in fact in this one. And so mourning would appear to be a lack of faith. But the question of what it would mean to recognize mourning is already a complicated one. Indeed, the question of recognition is in and of itself far more difficult than one might suppose. For de Silencio insists that the night of faith is unrecognizable. We are told that the nights of faith, quote, have a striking resemblance to that which infinite resignation, like faith, deeply disdains, to bourgeois Philistinism, end quote. And we are further told that the night of faith, quote, finds pleasure in everything, takes part in everything, and every time one sees him participating in something particular, he does it with an assiduousness that marks the worldly man who is attached to such things. No heavenly gaze or any sign of the incommensurable betrays him, end quote. So insofar as the night of faith bears a sign, it is the sign of the worldly man. Abraham's contemporaries could not have told him from a lunatic, for the knight of faith who might be a contemporary of de Silencio, though de Silencio reports that he has never found such a person, the situation is, if anything, still worse, since his fellows cannot tell him from an ordinary bourgeois. He does not stand out in any way. Abraham cannot speak because he would sound like a madman, but the knight of faith cannot speak because he would sound like anyone at all. And we are further told that the knight of faith, and I quote, drains the deep sadness of life in infinite resignation. He knows the blessedness of infinity. He has felt the pain of renouncing everything, the most precious thing in the world, and yet the finite tastes just as good to him as to one who never knew anything higher. And yet the whole earthly figure he presents is a new creation by virtue of the absurd, end quote. And so the description of the knight of faith emphasizes throughout his pleasure in this world, his real joy in the ordinary things of human life with infinitude. And so it might seem that he would not mourn. Now, if he did not mourn over the death of one he loved, one might suggest that that would in and of itself be a distinguishing mark. But we must proceed carefully with this argument, since a failure to mourn, though it would mark him, might not mark him as a knight of faith. It might rather be the moment at which he appeared to be a madman rather than an ordinary bourgeois. Perhaps he would not mourn because he counts on receiving again all that he loves as a new creation in the age to come. But he is already a new creation, and it is here and now that he loves. Would he then not also mourn here and now if one he cared for died? And I will return then to the question of the knight of faith to take up that question. For the moment, I want to reference Sylviana Gasensky's We Are Not Sublime, originally the fourth chapter of her Critique de l'égocentrisme, Critique of Egocentrism, which is notable among responses to fear and trembling because it does consider the dimension of love for the other that is mourning. And writing of the night that Abraham spent before the sacrifice, she writes, and I quote, mourning was already in his heart. That is what Johannes names the movement of infinite resignation, end quote. So she associates mourning with infinite resignation and implicitly excludes it from the domain of faith, though she will go on to suggest that the ethical leaves no room for mourning either. And she admits from the start of this essay that when she rereads Fear and Trembling, a text she once read with admiration for Abraham, now she is, quote, inclined rather to be suspicious of this exaltation of greatness, immensity, and the absolute, end quote. And so in her essays, she seeks the possibility of a love that would indeed mourn. And I will return later also to her essay. And for the moment, this is where I turn to either or and to Antigone. The account of Antigone that we find in Either Or, Part 1, comes to us attributed to a writer that introduced to by under the pseudonymous initial of A, and we're told that his papers were found and edited by one Victor Eremita. And A, speaking before the Fellowship of the Dead, tells a story of Antigone, an Antigone that he insistently describes as his, my tragic heroine, he calls her, as well as my work and my creation. This Antigone is the only one in all the world who knows her father's secret, that he has killed his father and married his mother. And indeed, she does not even know whether Oedipus himself knew of his guilt. A proclaims of her that, quote, she too does not belong to the world in which she lives. Although healthy and flourishing, her real life is nevertheless hidden. She too, although alive, is in another sense dead. This life is quiet and concealed. The world does not hear even a sigh, for her sigh is concealed in the secrecy of her soul. End quote. And crucially, she does not despair over the secret that she bears, though she does suffer from it. But in fact, quote, she is proud of her secret, proud that she has been selected in a strange way to save the honor and glory of the lineage of Oedipus, end quote. A regards Antigone as a tragic heroine because of her ambiguous guilt inherited from her father's line. In judging her to be a figure of tragedy, however, A operates from the limited perspective of the aesthetician. For Antigone, like Abraham, cannot speak. Both Abraham and Antigone are bearers of a secret that cannot be communicated, and both are thereby set apart from others. Their secrets are different, certainly, and indeed must be different, since otherwise they could, at least in theory, have communicated with each other. Yet by virtue of the secret, both are placed outside the ethical and also outside the aesthetic. For each one is related, by his or her secret, to another precisely as an individual. And it is this individual relation that neither the ethical nor the aesthetic can account for. And in this connection, it's worth noting that A reproaches modern tragedy with neglecting the tragic hero's ties to his lineage, with completely neglecting the hero's past, writing, quote, we load his whole life upon his shoulders as his own deed, make him accountable for everything, but in so doing, we also transform his aesthetic guilt into ethical guilt. In this way, the tragic hero becomes bad, evil actually becomes the tragic subject, but evil has no aesthetic interest, end quote. So in that regard, neglecting the individual's relation to others ends up subsuming the individual under the universal ethical law. But at the same time, the aesthetic theory of tragedy also cannot fully account for the individual as such, since theorizing the tragic hero and presenting his distinguishing signs cannot account for him precisely as one who, in his relation to the other, cannot communicate. And indeed, the fact that A's tragedy of Antigone remains unwritten underscores the gap that separates her from the tragic hero. A declares, I quote, she belongs to me, she lawfully belongs to me, and yet at times it is as if I had cunningly crept into her confidence, as if I always had to look behind me for her. And yet it is the reverse. She is always in front of me. Only as I lead her forward does she come into existence. End quote. He insists on his own agency, looking behind, leading her forward, but he cannot pin her down. She escapes the confines of his theory. And consider, moreover, Sylviana Gasensky's observation, and I quote, the play will not have been written, and therefore the tragedy will not have taken place. Antigone is nowhere present, vanished into the past or into the future, an absent poetic figure offered to our reflection, just to give us to think the repetition and the possible inheritance of the fault. End quote. And it's worth noting also her remark that the other for Kierkegaard is that which comes to interrupt and break the possibility of a specular circulation of one's own, end quote. Antigone then finds herself summoned by the other in advance of anything that she has done or could do. And the proper response to this summons is sorrow. And the Danish word that's translated as sorrow in the text of either or may also be translated as mourning. And in his description of Antigone's sorrow or mourning, A portrays it as an incommunicable secret, and one that she is, in fact, glad to bear, even as it is also a cause of suffering. We're told that she almost thanks the gods because she has been selected as this instrument, end quote. And one might object that Antigone, unlike Abraham, could have spoken, though she would have betrayed her father if she had done so. But her secret is not just the story of her father's guilt. It is also the relation to her father, whereby she may not speak. No one can take her place as a bearer of the secret any more than anyone could have taken Abraham's place. She could rebel against her father by proclaiming his crime, and Abraham could have rebelled against God by declaring that God had ordered him to kill his son for no possible reason, yet both remain silent. Antigone conceals her father's guilt. Abraham believes that God is not guilty. And this concealment and this belief are part and parcel of Antigone's and Abraham's respective secrets. And because each one is irreplaceable as the bearer of his or her secret, neither can speak. One might imagine an alternate version of the story in which Ismene also knew the secret of Oedipus, and in which each daughter thought that she alone knew it. Even so, they could not be substituted for another, as if they were interchangeable, since it is as individuals that they are bound to the other who is their father. And it's here, in light of this discussion of the bond to the other, that I return to the specific question of mourning a death. Antigone's mourning for her brother amounts also to bearing a secret. Certainly, Sophocles' Antigone does not hesitate to proclaim her sorrow over her brother's death, which culminated in the burial that she proudly avows. But in mourning also, no one can substitute for another. If Ismene and Antigone had gone together to bury Polynices, each girl would have borne the secret of her own mourning of her brother, for again, the two sisters are not interchangeable and would not be even if they had shared the project of burying their brother. Jacques Derrida has described the death of the other as the end of the world, with the survivor left to bear witness. And even when there are multiple survivors, none can testify in my place. One mourner's secret is far from being the only secret. Each day brings myriad deaths, and many who die leave multiple possible mourners. Secret must not, however, be taken as the name of a genus or species to which each individual secret would belong. Each mourner is summoned as a singular individual to the task of testifying to the world that has ended with the other's death. And each mourner can speak only to a limited degree, for no testimony can ever encompass the one who has died. Crucially, mourning marks the fundamental unacceptability of the other's death. I do not mean to suggest by this phrase that mourning is a flight from death. On the contrary, mourning looks at death and proclaims that the one death has taken is irreplaceable, that death is a wound in the very fabric of the universe. Mourning is a resistance to death insofar as it proclaims that death will not have the last word, that one will testify, however inadequately. And this resistance may, I propose, be an act of faith. Now, to be clear, I do not mean to suggest that all who mourn are anonymous Christians, to borrow Karol Renault's expression. I have already invoked Derrida's remarks on mourning, which envision no ultimate resurrection. But what I propose is that Johannes de Silencio, seeking to uncover the knight of faith in his anonymity, may see him at a funeral weeping like an ordinary bourgeois, and may for that reason walk straight past him without recognizing him. For mourning, in its resistance to death, in its testimony to the other person's singularity in the face of the abstractions of the universal, may mark the affirmation that what has been lost be restored. Thus it is fitting that Christ wept at the tomb of Lazarus, even though it is also paradoxical that God entered into history and so had the capacity to weep. Contrary to the argument that, since he knew he was going to resurrect Lazarus anyway, he had no possible reason for tears except his listeners' lack of faith, Christ, by weeping over his friend's death, expresses the profound necessity of the resurrection that he then brought about. Such a restoration or resurrection is paradoxical, since it supposes that time itself might be undone through the eternal, but only to be remade and healed. But the knight of faith is able to deal in paradox, and the tears of mourning are not the tears of despair. Antigone does not bury her brother out of despair. She wishes not to die, but to proclaim a love that is resigned neither to death nor to the oblivion that would fulfill death by forgetting the dead who once lived. Now here one might object that faith undermines mourning, that a Christianized Antigone would cease to mourn her brother because she would be sure that he was happy in heaven and that she herself would see him again there. But we must not pass too quickly over the ordeal of death. The knight of faith believes that he will see again the one whom he has lost, but he believes also that death is a great wrong, and he does not seek to be taken out of time. He has faith that God from his eternity will enter into time to heal it, but this healing will not end time. Abraham's ordeal perhaps did not leave time for mourning, since he believed that he would receive his son again in this age rather than the next. Though remember here that Christ did weep at the tomb of Lazarus, and that we do not know what happened in the night before Abraham set out for Moriah, but it does not follow that faith excludes mourning. For death, like guilt, is a hereditary ill, and one cannot insist that our temporal world must be restored and healed without also insisting that each death is worthy of being mourned. In this respect, Antigone in her mourning is a precursor of the knight of faith. And here I come back, finally, to Sylwiana Gasenski's We Are Not Sublime, in which, as I have said, she seeks a love that would be subject to mourning. Warning that an ethical command to love eternally would deny mourning, she writes, and I quote, "But existing can also be being able to love the finite and being capable of the finite, of saying yes to the finite, that is to say, to time, suffering the ephemeral, suffering loss without suffering it in advance, accepting the time of the wound of time, and the event of the other." End quote. Faith, however, believes not that temporal love will be taken up in the frozen eternity of the ethical, but rather that eternity actively enters into time. And the healing of time does not undo everything that might, following Agasansky, be named the wound of time. Think, for instance, of the scars on Christ's resurrected body. And we who are temporal are originally wounded in our dependence on the event of the other. In this respect, it is important to point out that in mourning, the knight of faith resigns the one whom he loved to God. He himself is without the power to resurrect the dead, and what Johannes de Silencio wrote of healing is also true of the healing that is resurrection. And I quote from Fear and Trembling, "For what love for God it takes to be willing to let oneself be healed when from the very beginning one in all innocence has been botched, from the very beginning has been a damned example of a human being." End quote. The Nietzschean eternal recurrence of the same is a hard word. Affirming the resurrection of the dead is no less so. For to affirm the resurrection of the dead by God requires affirming both the wrongness of death and one's own powerlessness to right that wrong. It requires affirming, moreover, that it is good that God alone can provide the necessary healing. Recall, finally, that mourning takes place neither within the aesthetic nor within the ethical. Indeed, love of God and love of others both take place within the suspension of the ethical. De Silencio writes that, and I quote, "Abraham can describe his love for Isaac in the most beautiful words to be found in any language," end quote. But this is not entirely true, for he is related to Isaac as one individual to another, and no words can state that bond. The ethical cannot express the relation that binds one singular individual to another, precisely because the ethical is the universal. This point makes Abraham's ordeal all the more incomprehensible, it is true. And at this point, I should perhaps therefore fall silent. But before I do so, I wish to note that this meditation on mourning may also serve as a warning of the dangers of total silence. A's Antigone cannot even say that she bears her father's secret without betraying him, since speaking of the secret would only invite others to guess at what that secret might be. But mourning a death is a secret that advertises itself as a secret, and that, moreover, must do so. Mourning testifies that one's own testimony is forever inadequate, that there is always a secret that cannot be spoken, and that there is an unsayable secret may at times be the most important thing to say. Thank you.